All right, hitting record here. It's noon. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to session 4 of 5 of this Forestry Lunch Break series. If this is your first session of the week, I'm Patrick Schultz, Extension Forester with Washington State University in Southwest Washington. Today, we are here to talk about excavators with Ken Bevis. Ken's back from his last session on Monday. Well, you've been with us all week, but he's back here to feature. Before we dig into that, though, usual logistics. Please make sure that you set your chat box setting to everyone, so that we're all seeing the questions and that it gets recorded in the transcript. Also, please remember that this is going to be recorded, and those recordings will be available at this website here. I sent that to you all this morning. I'll send it again tomorrow. And those will be up there basically in perpetuity. So you can just keep that link, go back and watch them whenever you'd like, especially if you needed to leave early or if you missed a session at some point this week. All right. Well, with that, then I will pass this along to you, Ken.
Thanks, Patrick. Okay, being recorded, so I can't say anything really dumb, but I'll try. Okay, so here we go. Welcome back. I'm leaving my face on here for a minute so y'all can see what I look like as a matter of politeness. I'm going to turn it off here in a second so that we get a little more bandwidth. And today I get to talk about something near and dear to my heart. And for those who've been around me a little bit, you know that I'm really interested, if not obsessed, with dead trees and cavity excavators and the whole elements of that part of ecology. So when we were discussing this series, this came up. It's like, how about excavators as a topic? So wait a second here. Let me turn off my video so I keep a little bandwidth. So we're going to talk about cavity excavators, which are woodpeckers mostly. And so here we go with that. And there's Woody to open it up for us. Here's my outline: excavators in general, the ecological roles, different species of interest, and then Woody Woodpecker, just as a side note. This is not an excavator. This is actually one of Brent's waterfowl that showed up in his presentation yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And I think Gary had it in there as a raptor too, but there's the rough outline here. So I have street cred on this one, that I actually studied cavity excavators and deadwood in grad school. Obviously, I learned a lot there. And so, you probably have gotten a copy of Primary Cavity Excavator Birds and Managed and Unmanaged Cavity Forests East Central East Cascades. Really catchy title in this analog classic from the 20th century. You probably heard of it. It's available at the library at Central Washington University. There's 3 copies in existence. I think 4 actually. So anyway, yeah, but I did my master's thesis on snags and woodpeckers in East Cascades Forest. So I spent a lot of time reading and thinking about woodpeckers. So woodpecker is a descriptive name. It's not phylogenetic. There's not some classification of birds known as woodpeckers, because there's different species and genuses involved. So it's kind of like duck or raptor or something like that. Little zoology reminder for those who like this kind of thing. Kingdom, phylum, class, order. King Philip came over from Germany, silly, and the order down here is where woodpeckers start to show up, but the genus and the species vary all over the place. So they're not necessarily closely related to each other, which is kind of interesting, because these different evolutionary threads, many still came up with this set of cool life history strategies. And so here are some of these features. So woodpeckers have this amazing skull that is specially designed to withstand impact. They don't get brain injuries. I like to, you like to say, why don't woodpeckers get concussions? And it turns out they not only have padded brains, but they also have special architecture that distributes the impact. You think of how hard they hit a tree with their skull. Their beak, it's a combination chisel and a tweezer, whack, 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 and you'll see them, they'll actually flip wood chips out of the way. Their tongue, and we could go on with this for a while, it wraps around their brain. There's actually a special channel that goes around the back of their skull and anchors at their nares. And the bloody thing is twice as long as their beak. And this is true of most species. It has sticky saliva and a barbed tip for getting those bugs out of that wood. Their feet are usually two forward and two back, for stability. Their feathers are special. And in particular, their tail is really stiff. If you ever have a chance to feel a stuffed woodpecker, their tail is really stiff so they can lean back on it while they're whacking on that tree. They mostly eat insects, but they will also eat fruit. I've actually seen a pileated woodpecker eating blue elderberry, and they will also eat tree sap, as in the sapsuckers, excuse me. Their displays are vocal, quick, 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 as well as rhythm. They do percussive territorial displays, which is really cool. So woodpeckers have multiple ways of communicating. So here we go. Their ecological roles. They're major predators on insects. So, a lot of our birds indeed are top of the food chain, going after the various insects. They will, this is my pet pileated woodpecker that I taught to sit still while I was teaching. I don't have him anymore. He moved to Ellensburg, but this is a flat-headed borer, which is the type of insect larvae that they might excavate out of deep wood. They excavate a nest cavity every year. They either make a new one or clean out an old one or somehow modify a cavity. I'll say more about this in a second. And while they do that, they're moving fungal spores around. So they're essentially a vector for moving these organisms between trees. And they're a keystone species, which means an animal that affects the habitat of other animals because they create these amazing cavities. So here we go. And here's an example. This is a tree swallow female that booted, according to the photographer, Greg Thompson, booted a hairy woodpecker out of the cavity, or I'm guessing the woodpecker abandoned it, but is using that cavity for a nest. So the ecological roles are really significant for these woodpeckers. Let's see, here we go. So I'm trying to get the thing to change here. Why is it not changing? Why are you not changing? Hello? Hello, PowerPoint. There we go. So a healthy forest. We talk a lot about healthy forests. Well, I would suggest that a healthy forest includes wildlife, includes all the wildlife, and includes dead trees. That's part of a healthy forest right there, that beautiful large snag full of cavities. And their ecological roles include this insectivorous thing. I mean, consider, when we talk about healthy forest or issues with forest health, we often bring up insect outbreaks. Well, who the heck is eating insects? Well, other insects are obviously, but birds do a lot. So insect problems, remember, birds eat bugs. And this is a chickadee going in to feed young. Oh, by the way, look at all those little caterpillars. That's a lot of bugs in the mouth of that bird. So every year they make or repair a new nest cavity every year, and they got to find a piece of dead wood that's soft enough for them to dig it. So it's got to stand there long enough to get soft enough for the woodpecker to dig it. And there's all kinds of variables on tree species and the depth of the wood, etc. But that's an important point, that the dead tree has to stand for a while to make these cavities. And this cavity is an adaptation for reproductive success, is entirely remarkable. It's a great place to raise a family. One entrance, solid walls. It's like a little fortress. And woodpeckers, males and females, both brood the young. Most species do. And so while they're little and really vulnerable, one or the other of the parents is present all the time. And they've got a bloody chisel attached to the front of their face. So if a bad guy came up here to try to eat the babies, which by the way, they do, squirrels, other birds, bam, they good defense. They have high fledging rates. Well, they do it once a year. They make a cavity, they clean one out, and then they go find another one. Well, those abandoned cavities are prime real estate for all sorts of other organisms. What are the three needs of wildlife? Food, water, cover. So that's cover. This is the keystone role. So these abandoned woodpecker cavities could be used by small birds, right out front. Small birds, including wrens, nuthatches, chickadees, that I'll say a little bit about, who also, the chickadees and the nuthatches will also clean out and create their own cavities. Little owls. I mentioned owls the other day, and the little toot owls, the saw silhouette, the pygmy, the screech. These guys love abandoned woodpecker cavities. Mammals, squirrels, there's our Douglas squirrel, flying squirrels, bats, they love to use these cavities. So the number of species that come along behind the woodpeckers and use their cavities is a lot. So therefore, a keystone species. Now let's go to some species accounts here. And I want you to notice these maps. These maps came from this cool program, Nature Mapping, and it'll give you an idea of where they are. And so I've chosen species that are associated with the forest. And I think this is an interesting map right here, that the pileated woodpecker, our largest woodpecker, we'll see a picture in a second. When I say length, that's from end of the tail to the top of the head, wingspan, weight. Look at the weight on this guy. Almost a pound, but not even quite. Largest woodpecker, they make these rectangular holes and they eat carpenter ants and wood borers. So when you see a tree that has these big square holes, and often it's a live tree like this live cedar, the pileated has gone into that thing with that giant beak and is getting into the carpenter ant galleries in the decayed center of that tree. If you have a tree like that on your property, that is a great tree to retain because those carpenter ants eat a lot of insects themselves. So here's a pileated woodpecker. Look at the beak on this thing. This is just amazing. If we were in person, I'd have my pet taxidermied pileated with me and to show you. So these things are amazing. Big red head. The male, let's see, wait, here we go. The male has red all the way down to the nose and has this mustache. The female does not have the mustache. So here they are, crawling into the cavity, and their cavity is pretty big in order to raise these dinosaurs things. I always think they look like pterodactyls in this hole in the trees. So the tree's got to be big enough to support the bird. So this is probably a 24-inch, I think that's an alder that these birds are, this picture was taken from. So look at the hairy woodpecker. The hairy woodpecker, notice the genus is different. Drycopes for pileated, Picoides for hairy, 10 inches, 15 wingspan. 2 to 4 ounces. Ounces, that's light. A forest generalist. I really like hairy woodpeckers because they occur pretty much in all forest types, and people are familiar with them, and they're not as dependent on big trees as pileatids are. But pileatids are pretty common too. Look at this map, referring back to the two. It's more or less the same range with some differentiation. And I note that here in the urbanized zones, these guys don't occur in farmland. But here's a hairy woodpecker, black and white stripe down their back, males with a little bit of red on their head, and using, indeed, again, nest cavities like this one. So there's a hairy woodpecker. A downy woodpecker, 5 to 7 inches, little guy, 1 ounce, weigh 1 ounce. These guys are more in broadleaf forest, cottonwood, aspen, big leaf maple, especially riparian zones. I kind of like this, that they go right up the Skagit River. They're down here in lower habitats in far eastern Washington, and they got to have really soft wood to nest because their beak is small. They look like a small hairy, oh yeah, I meant to point this out. They look like a big downy. So check this out. So here's a downy woodpecker, and birders, if you're seeing one or the other by itself, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, but look at the proportion of that beak. A downy has a little teeny beak, and here they are side by side at Scott Fitkin's bird feeder, and you can really tell the difference. So really the hairy is about twice as big as a downy, but their markings are essentially identical. But both of them common in our small landowner forest. So these are the two that you will encounter most, as well as the good old northern flicker. Northern flicker with orange on its wings, 12 inches, 4 ounces, kind of chunky. I say bird of open country, meaning they feed on the ground. You'll see them out walking around the ground. And I think this is kind of amazing. Look where they're not. That's Mount St. Helens. There's Mount Rainier. There's Mount Adams. Here's the Bone Dry Basin. There's the top of the Olympics. The flickers are almost everywhere. It's pretty cool. So they excavate in softwood, and they're the ones that bang on people's roofs and sides of their houses in the spring, like So when I was studying woodpeckers, it cracked me up that give a talk about woodpeckers and hand would go up and their question was almost always, why do they bang on the side of my house in the springtime? Which sort of cracked me up. And it's a territorial display to the woodpecker, and it's not always flickers, but usually is. Your house is just a big snag. So here's a flicker, and everybody's seen a flicker. These are males. There's the red mustache, and this is a female juvenile coming out of this. I think this is an interesting photo. Thanks, Greg Thompson. Burned soft snag, but yeah, there's a flicker. So flickers are cool. So let's look at these sapsuckers. This is kind of interesting. The red-naped sapsucker is the Eastern Washington common sapsucker. Well, these guys are migratory. They come in the spring. They do their thing with the sap wells, and people will ask me, there'll be the row of holes in a thin bark tree, and they'll say, "Is that damage?" Well, not really. It's kind of like almost it's kind of like parasitism, but not quite, where they wound the tree, it oozes sap, and they actually eat the sap and they eat the insects that are attracted to those wells. Side note, squirrels and hummingbirds will also eat that sap. They return to the same areas, they return to use the same trees. So here's the Eastern Washington red-naped sapsucker. And check this out. On the west side, and these two maps, it's like east, west. Wait a second, aren't they the same bird? Well, it turns out they will hybridize. I learned doing researching for this, but they're about the same size, and they're about the size of a robin. 2 ounces, 15-inch wingspan. Same thing, nesting in broadleaf trees, also migratory, and they're really kind of the same bird, but not. So in Eastern and Western Washington, if you see a sapsucker, meaning with red on its head and a kind of a blackish back, doing this, and look, there's insects right here. She's got a yellow jacket next to the sap wells. It's either the red-naped or the red-bellied sapsucker. Then you go over in Eastern Washington, and there's this interesting bird, the Williamson sapsucker. This is a highly migratory excavator in East Side Forest, really specializing in larches, Douglas fir at mid to upper elevations. And it's a really interesting bird because for the longest time, they were actually thought to be two different species because look at this male, this beautiful black, the little yellow belly. And here's the female is like, they're dimorphic. There's quite a few birds like this, but this one is one. And I was wondering that, wait a second. Now, who the heck is this Williamson's character? Well, there he is. Robert S. Williamson was the leader of a railroad surveying team down in in the Klamath Basin in like 1850. And his naturalist shot one of these, showed it to him, said, "Boss, what's this?" He goes, I don't know nothing about birds." And he named it after his boss. So Robert S. Williamson didn't even have any interest in birds, but he got one named after him. Lewis's woodpecker. Here's another interesting East Side funky bird. And they like open forests. They like oak woodlands. They like ponderosa pine. They catch insects on the wing. They hawk insects. They fly out. They have wide wings, and they go up. And they're not that common. The birders get really excited when you find Lewis's woodpecker. But this one on the right, honestly, bonked into a window at my house. And I went out, and he was kind of dazed, and I picked him up, and he flew away. So I think he was one of those ones that bonked. But look at this coloration. It's purple and red. They like open burn forest. And there they are. And they were named after none other than Meriwether Lewis, who posed for this interesting portrait after the big expedition back in 1807. And I just thought that was kind of fun. There's Meriwether himself, once again, in full frontier regalia. Okay, so here we go. White-headed woodpecker, pine specialist, about 9 inches, 2 ounces. So you notice a lot of these, other than the pileated, are about the same size. They're these robinish, and they're non-migratory. White-headeds need ponderosa pine, need big dead trees that they're known to go into larger diameter ponderosa pines. They eat pine seeds as well as insects. And they're our least studied woodpecker, though my friend Jeff Kozma is working on that right now. And as you might imagine, they have, yes, a white head, mostly black, red. This is a male with a little bit of red on the tip of the head, and a really interesting bird, the white-headed woodpecker. Excuse me. Another descriptive name, the black-backed woodpecker, roughly the same size, in that robinish size. But these guys are a burn forest specialist. I mean, they are so well adapted to fire that they're even colored like a burned tree. They don't excavate as much as they flake. So they'll take their beak, and I've watched them do this, they'll take their beak and flip the bark to get at the beetles underneath. And all of a sudden they'll show up after a fire. There'll be like lots of them. There's one, there's one, there's one. And then a few years later, they're gone. And how that works, we're not really sure. There you go. And their back, yes, actually is black. Interestingly, this species and the next one, the males have yellow on their heads rather than red. So that's just kind of interesting. You won't see these very often, by the way. The three-toed woodpecker, almost the same bird as the blackback, except their back is striped. They live higher in the mountains and are not quite as tied to fire. And well, yeah, they have 3 toes. I said woodpeckers have 4 toes. This one's got 3. Check that out. So there you go. So here's a 3-toed woodpecker. Look at the back on this guy, but they still have a yellow head, and they're closely related to the blackback. So 3-toads are kind of a holy grail for a lot of bird watchers because they're not very common. Blackbacks too, for that matter. So there you go. There's that stripe on the back for the 3-toed. So those were the woodpeckers. And now the excavators. Here's why I say excavators. And I'm going to just broadly describe chickadees. So chickadees are little songbirds. Brent, you can leave this one out if you need tomorrow. But chickadees are actually excavators. They will use that little teeny tweezer beak and make holes in soft wood. They'll go under the bark a lot of times, mostly non-migratory, though they will move around regionally, and they're part of these mixed flocks in the wintertime. So if you go out in your woods in the winter, sometimes you'll hear, and I know you've experienced it, so it'll be like chip, 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 and here comes this little gang of tiny birds through the canopy. And if you pause and look at them, you know, hopefully with binoculars, to be like, wait, there's a chickadee, and there's a nuthatch, and there's a kinglet, and there's a wren, and and they'll travel together. Chickadee is one of the birds named for its call. Chickadee dee dee dee, chickadee dee dee dee, which I think is kind of cool. There's actually 3 kinds of chickadees, and I'm lumping them together here for the purposes of brevity. I think I use that word right. There's the black cap, the chestnut backed in the mountains. So here's a black cap, which is the most common. That's what the map was. Chestnut backed would be basically west of the mountains, and the mountain would be in higher elevation with the little white stripe. But all 3 of them have the same life history, basically, that they're cavity nesters, they eat a lot of insects, and they're pretty cool little birds. The nuthatches, once again, I'm going to focus on the red-breasted nuthatch. Little guys, bigger than chickadees, though, sometimes migratory regionally. Once again, the mixed flocks, and these guys go hink, 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 hink. It sounds like a little toy trumpet. Eat a lot of insects and seeds. There's a red-breasted nuthatch. There's 2 other kinds, and that would be the I'm trying to get rid of that thing. That would be the white-breasted and the pygmy. But here's a red-breasted nuthatch. Something they do too is they will go up and down a tree. They can walk vertically and well, I guess vertically would be up and down, but they'll walk with their head down the tree to go looking for bugs. Okay, so here last section here, management for excavators. Dead wood, dead wood, dead wood, keep it around. Don't feel like you got to, quote, clean up your forest. I'm candidly, when I meet someone and they says, I want to clean up my forest, I fringe. I kind of cringe, not fringe, cringe, because forests aren't tidy. Forests have varying elements of live trees, dead trees, down logs. So you want to keep wherever you can that they're not a hazard. You know, keep your big trees, keep your hollow trees. Those are great features. You want canopy complexity, not even, and you want some down wood. Here's just, I want to make sure I get this tip out there to you manage for hazard to habitat. And that is, if you have a hazard tree, see if your arborist will top it for you, actually turn it into a habitat tree. I call it hazard to habitat. Here's how you do it. You take the crown out. Doesn't have to be, usually the remaining stem is below the crown. So it'll be somewhere between 30 and 50 feet. You get the weight out of it. And so, 8 feet is kind of a minimum height because that's a hairy woodpecker minimum nesting height. You want to have a larger diameter, a minimum top diameter, I don't know, 10 or 12 inches. Rough up the top, get the climber to do that. It looks a little more natural and birds seem to like it better. And if it's in a true safety situation, meaning it's next to your driveway or something, shorten it to where even if it fell over, which it will eventually, it won't hit anything serious like your house or your daycare center or something. And so these features will be there for a long time. It's so cool. I've seen a bunch of them now, and quite a few arborists are willing to do this. So here's one in the backyard in Snohomish, and these nice people were waxing eloquent about all the birds that were on their snag. If you're logging, get them to use that snipper machine I know they're flat, but that's okay, to make a bunch of these guys while they're logging. The critters will thank you. There's like 40% of our forest biodiversity is somehow associated with dead wood, and you'll like it too, just like this happy little landowner right here on the left. So there you go. And I want to wrap up with this, that woody woodpecker is one of the few, I thought it was only, but that's not true, because there is Yogi Bear, Winnie the Pooh. I'm thinking of cartoon characters based on real animals, Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker. And Woody Woodpecker in the late 1930s, this famous guy at the time, Walter Lantz, was on his honeymoon, and a woodpecker kept like banging on the cabin that he and his wife were in. This story I read. And he wanted to get rid of it. And his wife says, why don't you make a cartoon character out of it? Well, it was an acorn woodpecker, not affiliated, but his cartoonist, his team looked into woodpeckers and they came up with Woody, which arguably is affiliated, but not really. So he first appeared in 1940. He played regularly until 1972. There was a Woody Woodpecker cartoon show. I still remember it. And Woody Woodpecker has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. How about that? It's at 4000th Street, and no other, I don't know, Yogi Bear might be out there too, but Woody Woodpecker is on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which says to me, you should devote yourself to the preservation of deadwood habitats. Don't ask me how I got to that. So here's some photos. Thank yous, Greg Thompson, Terry Piper, Cornell Lab, and I did get a few off of the internet. So that's the iNet. And there we are. Thank you. How did I do, Patrick? 3 minutes. Great. Yes, 3 minutes. There's my email contact stuff, and use us. So yeah, I'm available to help you with different elements of what we do. Thank you. Yes, I made it under 30.
Well done, Ken. I'm glad that we were able to squeeze in a little bit of taxonomy on Woody Woodpecker. It's a good discussion.
Oh, okay. Wait, before I forget.
So that was impressive.
So the famous, right? Everybody knows that Woody Woodpecker's signature. Mel Blanc of Bugs Bunny fame was the first voice of Woody Woodpecker. And when he was doing it, he came up with that, and they liked it so much, they kept it. So whenever you would hear Woody Woodpecker do that, that was actually Mel Blanc, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, all those guys, was his voice for all those years. How about that?
Full of fun facts. All right. Well, please, we're a little light in the questions in the chat box, so please don't hesitate. Feel free to ask away. We've got some time here to talk with Ken, and we also got Brent and Gary on. So whatever your question is, I'm sure one of us can take a stab at it. But scrolling to the top here, well, there was a request for a link to your CD, Ken. So you should definitely plug that in the chat.
Oh yeah, I actually do have I can't. You have to do it, Patrick. I can't plug my music website. You have to do it.
Well, maybe I'll send it in a follow-up email, because I don't think I know that. Well, unless you send the site to me.
If you Google me, yeah, you Google me and you'll find it. I actually do have a music website.
Well,
Cool.
Todd had a question here. He says, I constantly get calls about woodpeckers hitting on trees and houses. Is there a way to deter woodpeckers? I've heard that putting shiny metal like aluminum foil
Yep.
around the tree or near the house will deter them. Is there any truth to that?
Yes, yes. Woodpeckers banging, and I guess you're referring to like the, or when they start chipping holes in your house where they start, because sometimes I think houses actually do have insects in them, and they will start foraging on certain corners and notches. The only thing you can really do is armor it, put some metal over it or something. And then the way to get them to quit drumming is same thing, harassment, something. If it's really bad, there's this netting that you can use to cover it up, and usually it's the same bird. So it's like it's a territorial bird that's learned to feed in that spot, or that's the best place to drum. It's a loud. I like the stories of people where the flicker, usually flicker, is on their the cap of their chimney, the metal cap, and they start at the crack of dawn, and it's like, so it's almost the same as window strikes. Yeah. Todd, so Todd, you must be like a landscaper or a builder. Yep. So there you go.
Interesting. Well, we got another really good question from Suzanne, who says, in forest management, pre-pack fish, which must be shorthand for something. We used to try and leave snags per acre. So she's clearly got some history with forestry.
Nice.
Then we
Yep.
evolved to snag patches. And with the reality of logging safety, what is the
Yep.
current strategy for leaving snags and habitat in managed forests?
Yep.
And it sounds like she's got some personal experience with
Oh,
someone that was
man.
injured from a wildlife tree
Wow. Oh, Suzanne, I'm so sorry
or
to hear
died.
that.
Actually, yeah.
I know, and that's like that's the what's the word? The thing we just don't want to have happen. She's right. We've evolved to snag patches, but Suzanne, I want to point something out today, that most logging these days is being done with mechanical falling, with the big
Mm,
feller bunchers, other than on steep slopes where we still got the cables and the fallers on the ground. So you almost have two categories of logging safety questions. So if they're logging with those big machines, most of those units, nobody is on the ground. Nobody's on the ground. That big machine is going, they're doing whole tree yarding. They're taking them over to the landing. But patches are usually safer, yes, because you can buffer it. People can be careful around it. So the current strategy of leaving snags in managed forests is it's still subject to, how do I say, the goals of the landowner. And LNI has not changed its tune at all, that technically any standing dead tree can be considered a hazard. Sometimes the shorter ones, they will not make an issue out of. And so now I actually present to the Washington Contract Loggers Association. And and a rigging slinger was a person on the ground pulling the cables around, and oh, I'm so sad for that. So it's still at the discretion, but Washington forest practices laws say you will retain 2 wildlife trees per acre that will provide habitat for cavity nesting species. That's almost exactly the language. What the heck does that mean? That doesn't say snag. It doesn't say, wildlife tree of this or that standard. So I'm constantly what's the word, advocating for those snips like I just described, because in a mechanical side, if they're cutting it off at 15 to 20 feet or 10 to 20 feet, and it's just the stub, there's really not much that can fall out of the top of it. So yeah, I know, Suzanne, that's a really deep and significant thing, because we're acknowledging the importance of these structures while trying to provide for safety. And how do you do that? It's really
right.
complicated. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Ken. The next question here.
Oh wait,
I've no.
did you see the one about flickers and boxes?
Did I skip one?
Yeah, right above
Oh
Suzanne.
yeah, I did. I look for the question mark, and I didn't see one there.
Oh
So,
yeah,
will northern flickers use nest boxes?
they will sometimes, Susie. And the trick is you stuff them full of sawdust, like literally stuff them so they have something to do. Yeah. So they have something to do. Yep.
So then the next one was I've noticed that after a flush of mushrooms on a dead or dying tree, birds decimate the wood with dying mushrooms. Are they eating the insects or the mycelium?
Probably both.
Mm-hmm.
Probably it's because mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of the mycelium, and it's all indicative of that remarkable decay, what's the word, succession. As wood breaks down, there's all these different funguses working on it, there's different insects, and the woodpeckers are actually kind of they are the top of the food chain, going after the stuff that's breaking down the wood. And so woodpeckers don't really, quote, damage trees. They're indicating to us the things that are working on trees. Yeah, so that's a really good observation, that they might eat the dying mushrooms too. So the dying mushrooms probably have insects in them that are probably different insects than the ones that are in the wood.
So Marion asked why you didn't cover the acorn woodpecker.
Yeah, Marion, that's a very good question. Acorn woodpeckers are a totally cool species that actually cache acorns. And the reason I didn't is because their range in Washington is pretty limited down in the Columbia Gorge. They're mostly a species of Oregon and points south. There's a
Sure.
few incidences in Klickitat. There was one tree. I don't know, Marion, I don't know if you're a birder, but there was this one tree on public land where the acorn woodpeckers were always there, and people would drive from miles to go see them. So the acorn woodpecker is a really interesting species that is relatively uncommon in Washington. That's why.
Is there enough habitat even further north where you see like Thurston County, some Oregon oak habitat? Is that just not enough?
Yeah, there may have once upon a time been. I don't think there's enough.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah, and in Washington, the oak habitat is 97. Actually, Oregon and Washington, Oregon white oak dominated forest is 97% gone.
Yeah.
And so it's our most diminished forest type. And that's not to say where oaks used to be dominant, there's not forest, but there is, but it's Douglas fir because anyway, so yeah, that's Patrick, you should do a seminar on
that. Nice.
Oh wait, you just did.
Right. Yeah. For those of you that don't know, did the forestry lunch series previous to this was on hardwoods, and we talked Oregon oak. So I can certainly get that link to anyone that's interested. Next question here. Joan asked, would it help to drill some holes in a snag or use a hole saw? If so, what diameter?
Joan, that's been a question that comes up again and again when people are like when we want to do something to a tree to help them. And what I've observed is that it doesn't help, because when you drill a hole, you're not necessarily accessing the rot in the tree. Now, it might work later, but just to give them a starter hole isn't what they need. What they actually need is the softer wood in the middle of the tree. And so, yeah, it does. And I mean, the birds will do the work. I finally arrived at this, that for maintaining and even creating snags, you don't have to put holes and slots and everything, which is gratifying, because the birds will find it. If once it softens up enough and a flicker gets in there and makes a 14-inch deep cavity, you can't really do much better than that. Here, I turn my thing back on. So, a flicker cavity will be, that deep, and the hole's that big around. You would be hard pressed to build something better than that. So you build it and they will come.
Anna asks, do they nest in pine trees? And I don't know if she's referring to a specific one or just all excavators.
Yes, they definitely do. Definitely. Yeah. Mostly ponderosas, urban settings. It's a whole urban forestry question of like an Austrian pine or a jack pine or something. Would they be utilized as a snag? Well, generally we don't get a chance to, because they're ornamentals, and ornamentals don't last. But yes, definitely will nest in pine trees. Yes.
Why are there more species of woodpeckers in eastern Washington than western?
I would absolutely be speculating, but it might be due to fire ecology, where there's pulses of dead trees. I don't know, Patricia, that's a very good question, because she's right. Blackback, three-toed, Williamson's sapsucker, Lewis's woodpecker, white-headed woodpecker. Go over to Western, we've got red-bellied, pileated, hairy, and downy. And and then you have all those over there on the east side too. I don't know. I'm gonna have to bug. You made me bug on that one.
Might have got stumped. Brent, Gary, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that too. Feel free to speak up. But
yeah, I think it's Ken probably kind of nailed it with that relationship to fire ecology on the landscape and just kind of the patterns of how that's moved around over there.
Interesting.
Or so on the west side.
And on the west side, the decay trajectory would be slower and more consistent with fewer pulses.
Yeah. Yep. Snags, I think, probably persist longer on the west side. Just a slower decay rate. Maybe.
So there you go. Yeah. So tied to decay rates and tree mortality reasons. Okay.
Just a guess.
Well, you cobbled up a pretty good answer, I think.
Slightly educated.
I like that, Gary. Slightly, marginally.
So Elena asked, do woodpeckers lay more than one brood per year?
Usually not, but sometimes they will, if, to my understanding, they've lost their brood early enough. And so that, I think, is part of the response to the cavities, that they have really high success rate and they invest a lot more in their brood, so that because they're able to protect them and everything. So, and usually not like say quail that'll do even 3 broods per year because they often get nailed. Yeah.
So Jason asked, is a bufflehead duck considered an excavator?
No. Brent, what do you think?
No, there's no ducks will do any excavating.
Yeah, there you go.
They're just taking advantage of it. Yeah.
I wonder if they would they might flick some chips, but they don't dig out a hole, right?
Yeah. And they won't even bring nesting material into a hole. So I wouldn't imagine they'll excavate too much of one.
And so woodpeckers they'll as they chisel out the hole, they'll make a little bed of chips, but they'll move stuff out. You'll see them throwing stuff, like they throw out fecal sacks. Like when they're young poop, they'll actually clean the cavity up and throw them out. So yeah.
Sounds like buffleheads just don't really want to do any work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they have their feathers.
Yeah, they're resting because they migrate.
Sure. Right. Lorna asked when the recording. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gary.
I was just saying it's all about energy conservation, right?
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, there we go.
Lorna asked when the recordings will be available. I'd say early next week at the latest. Likely I'll have this one up by this afternoon, though. Let's see. Where are we? Is there anything we can do to deal with starlings taking over woodpecker nests? Do they compete for nests at the same time?
Yes, they do. And it's usually in settings where there's like a kind of an agricultural or urban spin on it. And this is a serious problem because starlings, for those who don't know, they're everywhere. They were introduced a century ago, and they're secondary cavity species, and they're really aggressive and they're really smart. Really the only thing you can do, well, 2 things you can do, is you can actually kill them. If you can wait till the territorial starlings are taking over that cavity, you take them out. And if you live rural, I mean, bluntly, I've actually done this a few times, and they're really territorial. They're like, they'll dibs a cavity and then defend it. And the other one, and people do this with nest boxes, is they'll cover up the hole until they think their bluebirds or their other birds are coming, and the starlings haven't had a chance to take over. Now, that being said, in an urban setting, you know what, starlings, you got them. They're here to stay. So yes, you can do some things, but it's usually in the form of direct intervention by way of covering the holes or trying to take out the starlings.
Awesome.
Hey, wait, I got one, Patrick. This isn't a question, but I just read this. Marion says she just read a wonderful book, Deadwood, The Afterlife
Yeah.
of Trees. I just read that, Marion. I saw it in the bookstore, and I got to write Ellen Wall a fan letter. That was so good. Yes. Thank
And when
you.
are you going to
Marion.
get a tattoo of a snag?
I'm not doing no tattoos. I'll do it with a Sharpie.
Sure. There you go. Lisa asks, do the sap wells harm the trees? People seem to lose their minds when they see
They
them,
do.
and then but they do look bad if it's a tree in your yard,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, especially an
I've-
ornamental tree.
I've seen them kill branches and sometimes like a small fruit tree. It probably does weaken the tree, but now here's one. Okay, when you see one of those places where there's the row upon row of the sap wells, study them, and those birds come back and they don't open the same wells every year. They'll go back and they'll move up like 4 or 5 rows, and the old ones will harden over and be black, and then the new ones will be light colored. So they're like doing it periodically. So I personally think it's kind of successful. I guess parasitism is probably the right word. They're taking advantage of the tree. I don't know if the tree gets anything out of it other than the woodpecker coming and eating insects that otherwise might harm the tree. And yes, people don't like it. And the only option you have really is to armor that tree. I saw one time where somebody had a fruit tree, then this one particular branch that was just the right size was all chewed up. So they put a piece of metal on it and it worked. And then the tree healed over and, and the branch didn't die. So yeah, that's true.
Nice. Well, Dawn did share the link to your website, so
yeah.
that's up there now, which is good.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, and the woodpecker song is
Like
on.
she only sent it to the hosts and panelists instead of everybody, Patrick.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll go ahead and copy that then.
Oh, shucks. Thank you. I'm not supposed to promote myself on at
Oh,
work.
it's probably
Thank
true,
you.
but I can, I think.
Yeah,
So.
you can. Sure. Well, it's not exactly like, if you're a folk singer, you'll become a tenionaire.
So Kay asks, are downed logs less likely to be a food source than trees left standing? Also, will woodpeckers use? Oh, so there's 2 questions. I'll let you answer the first one.
Are down logs less likely? It depends on the species. Down logs get used quite a bit actually for feeding. They can't be a nesting, obviously, substrate for most. Now, sometimes chickadees and nuthatches and such will make cavities in down wood. Less likely, I don't know. I would say no, they're different. They're different. And I've many times seen woodpeckers foraging on down logs. Yes, and woodpeckers will use nest boxes, not very much, and you do need to stuff them with chips. Send me an email and I will link you to, but you can go to Cornell Lab of Ornithology. There's different places to look up nest box fans, but I don't usually promote woodpecker nest boxes just because they don't use them. And yeah, but they can, yes.
So it kind of back to the deterring them from damaging your house. Chuck asks, does putting up a nest box deter flickers from digging into a house, and how close or how far should you put it?
No, it would not, because the flicker is not digging in your house to build a nest. It's digging in your house to display or feed. And honestly, I wouldn't do that. I would not encourage them to be close to your house. You want them to be far away. So it's not like you would be substituting something. My neighbor tried that and I actually was like, Bill, what are you up to there? Yeah.
So here's it's a funny comment and then kind of a broad question. Carol says, I wonder if there are others who have almost called a repair person after repeatedly hearing weird sounds from the fireplace. So our question is, should gardeners consider bringing in dead logs for excavator habitat, I assume? And if so, what kinds for what landscapes?
Whatever you could get, and dead wood in your garden is always a nice touch. I would suggest something that mimics whatever your local forest is, and an alder or a cottonwood or something would decay faster. But whatever you could get, that's similar to what's natural for your place. And the reason to always use native vegetation of different kinds is because that there's some organism that will respond to that feature, which is just kind of an interesting thing. Thank you, Jason. Look at that. Jason's shown us the wax that essentially acknowledged that state law, no, excuse me, to be redundant, state law acknowledges the importance of these habitat features.
So the next question from Sheila is, why do flickers destroy our bluebird boxes? Any thoughts?
I think they open up the hole so they can get inside and then they roost in them. You mean destroy, like they chip the hole open bigger, correct?
She doesn't specify, so maybe she can.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, where flickers will make the hole bigger, and some people will respond to that by putting some kind of a guard around the hole so they can't. Squirrels will do that too. So, and if they did chop them up, they're either after insects or they just they're vandals and they get a thrill out of it. No, I'm kidding about that.
So Debbie asked for the link for the hardwood series that we did last month. I went ahead and put that in the chat. So so all the recordings for that are there. John asked, do you know the lifespan of white-headed woodpeckers? We've had one nesting pair for over 10 years. They move their choice of snags around our forests.
Yep.
Are they different birds or the same bird?
You know, Jeff Kozma has been doing some banding work in the Weenass for quite a few years, and he works for the Yakimas. He's a good friend. And yeah, he has one that was 12 years old, knowing for sure the same bird. So probably they are, some of them, the same birds, relatively long-lived. But in medium-sized birds like that, a really long lifespan would be, 15 years would be really old. So probably, John, a successful bird. And with birds, mortality is really high when they're young, and then mortality drops off as they become experienced and know how to survive. Yeah. Oh, and Suzanne makes a comment about skyline logging. Yes, it definitely still takes place, in which case you should cluster your wildlife trees so you don't have to go around them. Yep. And Suzanne, I'm sorry to hear about that accident.
So Emily asked if you could circle back on the question about mycelium. So just kind of touching on the idea that the woodpeckers may also be feeding on mycelium in rotted wood. I'm not sure.
Only, and this would be kind of a little bit of insight from Ellen Cole's book about the sequence of decay organisms, especially relative to fungus, i.e. mycelium, and even bacteria breaking down the wood, excuse me, and then the tiny creatures that are either responding to the waste products of that, like springtails and little teeny aphids and such, and then the thing slightly bigger than that, and then the thing slightly bigger than that. So if a woodpecker was feeding on somewhere in that food chain, it probably was in something big enough to make it worth its trouble.
Okay.
And so, yeah. And that was an ignorant response, meaning ignorant. I don't really know that much about it, but I did read that. Yeah, the afterlife of trees. That's so cool.
So this is the last question we have. Is the drumming from excavators also a sign of, or part of mating?
Absolutely. Yes. It's because they don't really do it in the winter. Like in the fall, you don't hear. It's a territorial percussive display. Yep.
All right. Well, that is everything. And it is going on almost to noon now. So I think, Ken, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post your YouTube link of the.
Oh, yeah.
This is the bear song, right?
Yeah, that's the bear. Yeah.
So for those of you that are still on and want to close things out with one of Ken's great songs, go ahead and click that link. And any final thoughts, Ken or Brent, Gary too? Anything to add?
Well, just I'll make my last comment. And deadwood's critical to our natural ecosystem. Maintain it, install it in safe fashion, obviously, wherever you can. And it can't be overestimated how important it is. And it's something that we kind of overlook a lot of times. And so that picture right there is my favorite snag in the Methow that's on Patterson Lake. It's actually out in the water, and the eagle, there was an eagle nest right behind it, but they always perch on it. And that's just kind of a cool photo. That's not photoshopped. Okay.
Good to know.
Nice. Okay.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you. Brent, did you have something?
No, I was just gonna say that was a great job by Ken, and I enjoyed the Woody the Woodpecker sounds.
Yeah.
All
Cool.
right.
Thanks,
I think he's been
everybody.
practicing.
Yeah.
For how many years now? Wait a second.
Yeah. Great job, Ken.
Thanks,
All
kids.
right. Well, we'll close it out there. And thank you, Ken. Again, we will be back tomorrow at noon to talk songbirds with Brent. And I'm sure Ken and Gary will be with us as well. So
Yeah.
have a great rest of your day. We'll
will do.
see you tomorrow.
Yep. And if y'all got any questions or good pictures or something, there's my email. So
Great.
look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Patrick. Great job. And
Thanks, everyone.
see you guys later.
All right.
Thanks all.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.